Uh, this is Alex Kelsick, and I would like to invite Dr. Karen Johnson today to speak a little bit about um, his theory of biological quantic medicine. Um, uh, and today he's going to talk about its relationship to Christology. Um, we have gone through his theory in two programs, and he has given us an explanation of what he's doing. And I'm going to give him the floor now and pose questions to him about with the Christian faith and with Christ, and how he identifies his theory uh, with Christ.
So thanks, Alex. The science and the relationship to Christ consciousness. This is a kind of a difficult subject from the perspective that most scientists will really kind of look at what I'm saying with a grain of salt, so to speak. And probably would be turned off by the approach that I've taken. But it comes down to looking at the motif of a cross in our own understanding of science, and the relationship of the cross within the Bible. There's many people have kind of looked for cross-based geometry within biology in terms of the connection between, well, what was spoken about in the Bible, and others have kind of identified a cross in a integrin, a particular protein that's involved in binding cells to the extracellular matrix. I've got a different kind of model, right? I've got a model where I've looked at the relationship between Christ dying on the cross and the role that light plays in biology. So there's a foundation in biology that is obviously atomistic and that materialistic reductionistic kind of perspective.
Yes, we've spoken about that.
And so that model of this external physical world, this external reality, has a missing piece, right? It's missing an understanding that will allow you to go from an atomistic perspective to then be able to identify dark energy, dark matter, and matter. And at the moment, we've got an atomistic model in that the standard model of particle physics that allows us to identify atoms, but it doesn't allow us to identify what dark matter and dark energy is. So there's a mismatch there. So what I've kind of been looking at is, well, we have the right-hand rule of electromagnetism. Maxwell, Einstein talks about light and the speed of light as a constant. In the Bible, light plays a significant role as well, where Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father. And for me as a scientist, I look at, well, the right-hand rule and Jesus seated at the right hand. I looked at those two and saw a commonality. And so I was willing to explore the common themes between what's taught in the Bible and the biological knowledge. We obviously see light with our eyes. And the assumption is that we've made, and that I've been taught, is that the light that we're seeing is coming from us from an external source, from the sun. And when you have that perspective, yeah, you have this external physical world that you live in, that's atomistic. You're grounded in a reductionistic perspective, which is missing 95% of the universe. So for me, as a Catholic, has been baptized, I was looking for a way that I could bring together the decade of knowledge that I had as a scientist and this new kind of faith that I had, looking scientifically at the Bible, and trying to reconcile between this scientific model that I learned at university and the biblical model, to see that there are actually common themes running through them. The science of the cross for me then kind of became a way of looking at atomic structure. So rather than seeing or the atom as being the solid matter, I looked at it in terms of the forces, and one of the forces is electromagnetism, and that's light. So light is an electromagnetism. With Einstein, E equals mc squared. Well, c squared, that's light squared, the speed of light squared. I rearranged that equation to make it c squared equals E divided by m. And in that kind of rearranged or an inverted geometry, light, the fastest thing in the universe, so Einstein said, you put that first, so make that c squared equals E divided by m. So rise over run on a mathematical cross in straight line mathematics where y equals mx plus c, you get m being rise over run. So E divided by m in this kind of context, for me at least, I looked at it as a mathematical way of looking at rise over run. So an electromagnetic system of light where there's this electric field and this magnetic field at right angles to each other. So I was able to place a rearranged Einstein geometry onto a mathematical cross, and then looked at E negative E, M negative M, and saw a mirrored symmetry through a singularity at the center of the cross. So I used that functional model of the cross into the geometry of the atom hydrogen to see positron-electron pairing in the electric and the magnetic field orientation and that 90-degree angle, which was associated with the right-hand rule of electromagnetism and Jesus being seated at the right hand of the Father. So I kind of looked for a common way of exploring light electromagnetism in the geometry of a cross, to see a way of trying to connect Einstein's theory of mass equivalence with the biblical geometry of this cross. What I ended up experiencing and discovering was that in this kind of dopamine structure, so if we have a look now at applying the cross-based geometry within atoms, and if we have a look at our neurotransmitters and how they function. So why is this cross-based geometry in atoms interesting? Well, if every action has an equal and opposite reaction, then in a sense you keep and maintain a state of zero. So two things can separate from a single point, just as a positron and electron separate. And as they get further and further apart, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And therefore, as they move further apart, the center point in the middle sees it as essentially zero. And the reason for that is, as it's moving that way, it's cancelled out by moving that way. So we have a point of balance at the center. And so from that perspective of the center and it moving in opposite directions at the same speed, then, and opposite charges, then every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So I kind of utilized that thinking to maintain a zero state. And that was essential for positron-electron pairing and a cross-based geometry, where light's coming out in the Z dimension, where you have two photons traveling in opposite directions, and they can cancel each other out. So in a sense, because they're moving at the same speed, there's in effect at that center point no change, because of both directions cancel each other out. So it's that kind of mirrored symmetry of opposites that was important to understand how photons operate within the structure of atoms, and how to consider electromagnetic fields within atoms aligned with positron-electron pairs, and how that really redefined the geometry of electrons and positrons. What, positrons are in atoms? Yeah, that was the kind of big missing piece, really, is that the supersymmetry inversion, or the mirrored symmetry model, identifies that positrons are present, and that allows electromagnetism to be present within the structure of atoms. And it was that s orbital layer cross-based geometry that linked back to this atomic cross, to allow quantum tunneling and entanglement, which was really associated with the hydrogen atom. So because hydrogen is really the only atom that's enabled to quantum tunnel because of this geometry, the cross-based geometry, I went looking for where hydrogen is important in human biology. And we can see that in the process of energy production in the mitochondria and ATP, and forming a proton gradient, and then that traveling through the ATPase to produce ATP and water as a byproduct. So hydrogen in that water is quantum competent. And so the water, when protonated, H3O plus, again, we have a cross as a positive in terms of that geometry. 3 hydrogens, that proton can travel to other elements in our biology, including amines. So amines under certain acidic conditions will be protonated. So they go from NH2 to NH3 plus. And I looked at the Passion of Christ, carrying the cross, falling 3 times, the death and resurrection, the second coming, the attributes of dying on the cross between 2 sinners. So the model of the Passion of Christ, I saw a relevance to in terms of the physics operating in the unconscious part of the human mind associated with the neurotransmitters outside of the neuron. And I looked at that relationship closely. What kind of drew me to that conclusion was the Passion of Christ, and the third layer of the hydrogen atom has a passion line. That's the N equals 3, the infrared transitions. If you think the third layer and Christ falling 3 times carrying the cross, then the third layer could be, well, you have to actually travel down to the second, and then the first, and then into the center of the atom, into the singularity, in order to get quantum tunneling to occur in that cross-based geometry. the other aspect of the scientific model of the neurotransmitter functioning as an atomic isotope generating system for time reversal symmetry, the second coming, the hydrogen coming back out of the atom in its decay. The other aspect that I also considered, which was the three people being crucified on the cross, in the amine protonation, there's an NH3 plus, so there's an atomic amine cross of sorts outside of this aromatic ring Faraday cage system of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And the NH3 plus aligns with the hydrogen being delivered into the ring through infrared wavelengths of light. So it's outside of our visible wavelengths of light. There's been scientific research done to show that the infrared wavelengths are supportive of cognitive improvement. And, if we think about the memory system associated with quantum tunneling, linked to the dopamine structure and the atomic cross NH3 plus delivering hydrogen at 820 nanometers as part of the Paschen line, then you can kind of see pieces of the puzzle being kind of constructed around the Passion story, the Passion of Christ. So for me, I looked at Christ not only as the human being, but as the atomic hydrogen atom within my own biology, in order to understand the functionality of time reversal symmetry and isotope decay happening to give an orientation of the flow of time based on high energy release of isotopes decaying to low energy as the light photon expands. So there's a very clear, at least for me and the work that I've explored, the deepest kind of connections between electromagnetism and Christ being the light, the way, the truth. It was too much of a coincidence, really, not to consider the functional role of the atom hydrogen and its quantum properties in the way of quantum tunneling and entanglement in order to generate these isotopes housed as a memory system, a memory of light, and then the isotope decay that happens as a way of providing memory recall and the second coming, right? So this model that I've been developing really looks to unite science with spirituality. It looks to do so through connecting the geometry of the atomic cross within the structure of the atom and the electromagnetic field, the electromagnetic force. And from that kind of perspective, the biology of neurotransmitters, including dopamine, and the role that hydrogen plays in the atomics, aligned. It aligned to the spiritual teachings of the Passion of Christ and the Passion story. So, there was this whole kind of paradox that the Bible's not scientific. But the more I look into it, the deeper I go into it, the more it becomes structurally more aligned with how the universe operates within us as our biology, as this kind of quantum biology reveals a new science, a science of hydrogen and how it operates to generate energy. And we, and as a biochemist, we understand energy as ATP production from the mitochondria. I get that. We don't consider radical chemistry as a source of energy. We haven't considered the hydroxy radical as being beneficial for regeneration in biology because of its ability to break down the molecules within cells back into CO2 and water as part of that death regeneration system that's inherent within biology. So I guess the science that we've been really focused on and has been this kind of dogmatic perspective of DNA to RNA to protein, and then that has been a functional framework in which biotechnology is really kind of focused its energy and efforts on, and it's kind of negated the hydrogen-based biology that's operating, because it's water's everywhere. How can that be important? There's too much of it to be important, kind of thing. But we've focused our efforts and energy on carbon-based biology, and the standard model of physics says that carbon is 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons. Again, the conceptual framework of this matter-based physical reality. We've kind of overlooked the functional understanding that biology has at its very foundation hydrogen as the key energy system that's operating within it. And the isotope physics mediated time reversal symmetry, the atomic timing of things, is dependent on being able to put hydrogen into an atom to make it unstable, to create an isotope. And the Passion story, the Passion of Christ, for me, became a way of understanding how cross-based geometry of every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That balance of opposites, the zero-point state, provides a way of understanding how photons within the atomic structure of the electromagnetic field were able to be transferred from one place to another as light, or biophotons, or neutrinos and antineutrinos are released from the atom in its beta decay in order to stabilize the atom, but actually convey information to the surroundings in that biologically relevant way. The Passion story became central to how biology operates through hydrogen. So the amine atomic cross, NH3+, delivering hydrogen into the aromatic ring, the pi electron system. So, and the creed, the biblical creed, the Lord's Prayer, all of those things have an atomic meaning in understanding how biology operates. And we have, I guess, not been taught how to connect the spiritual dimension of inner light within an atomic structure into our everyday thinking of how biology operates. Because it happens so naturally and normally, we've forgotten that the human retina point inward, right? We've forgotten that we see our dreams at night with our eyes closed, and it's the mind that's generating the light through isotope decay that's responsible for seeing dreams. So I got to kind of witness this spiritual healing at church in 2013 as an atomic decay. And that really set me on a completely separate path from modern day science and biotechnology. It took me away from the idea of this physical reality and into an atomic light-based geometry that conveys information through a central singularity at the center of every atom in the nucleus. So, I've been building a kind of scientific model in order to reintegrate that experience into my life, essentially a time travel, atomic decay, negative time dilation experience at church. So it was considered as, mental illness, bipolar, a crazy experience that couldn't be explained. And, I've taken a decade of my life to go away and look at it and figure out scientifically what happened, how it happened, and the consequences of building this new scientific model provides a cross-based geometry within the hydrogen biology. So that gave me the I guess the link between a scientific perspective of reductionism and that Western perspective, and an unscientific perspective of a spiritual healing that was more founded in a Christian understanding. And I was looking for a way of trying to unite those two. And the way I did it was to restore the charge parity, and isotopes, and the positron electron pairing in quarks within neutrons and protons. And in kind of doing so, I've identified the presence of a positron for every neutron within the atom. So I've got a rearranged geometry and the geometry of a cross as a foundational understanding of how light operates within the structure of atoms. So that's how I've kind of connected between the biblical teachings of the Bible and the scientific teachings of kind of Western reductionistic materialism. And in kind of doing so, found a foundation away from materialism into a kind of electromagnetic right-hand rule of electromagnetism and the cross-based geometry that provides within s orbitals. So the spiritual connection of the model that I've been developing is really foundational, based on hydrogen biology, and that operates through a cross-based geometry between positron-electron pairs. So it's a way of looking at the animals go in 2 by 2. The animals in Noah's Ark, the flood, associated with how hydrogen and water is associated with the construction of atoms in the formation of isotopes in these aromatic ring systems. So, there is information that is both scientific and biblically relevant, and the two can be connected together when one understands how the geometry within the structure of an atom is created through hydrogen. And so the walls, so to speak, are built by 4 building blocks at a time, either a proton and an electron, or a neutron and a positron. And in that mirrored symmetry state, stability is obtained within that atomic structure. And it's really this quantum tunneling and entanglement system that's responsible for taking 2 photons and making a proton with 3 quarks and an electron. And that's really some new science that really underpins atomic light structure. And, if we think about the human body all being created from hydrogen as its foundation, then there's a shift away from the thinking of carbon-based biology into hydrogen-based biology, and the quantum coherence that occurs through entanglement, which is created through quantum tunneling of hydrogen to create new atoms, really kind of conveys a different role that hydrogen plays in our biology. So there's a profound shift that quantum biology is making. It's kind of taking us into an understanding of how light operates within the structure of atoms, and it's providing context for this biblical information that we've been taught as part of photophoton chemistry. The ability to stimulate photophoton chemistry and the generation of biophotons within OBHAVE Empowering Healing all comes down to some really interesting nanospeed second physics that's happening within the product. The release of the biophotons is really the release of the electromagnetic field within the structure of the atom itself. How this actually occurs is very strange. What is happening is that hydrogen is being added to the atom housed in the aromatic ring system, and that atom all of a sudden becomes unstable. It becomes an isotope, and that isotope decay is what's releasing the biophoton out of the single atom system housed in the aromatic ring. So this photofenton system is connected directly to putting hydrogen into the atom. Oh, behave, empowering healing.